You're recording, and I can see that you are. I'll just start and see how we get on. So, hello, my name is Michael Clarke. I'm the former director of the Royal United Services Institute in London, and I'm pleased to be able to make a contribution to this FETASA conference, even though we're at different ends of the globe. And though we're at different ends of the globe, we're all aware that the world is in a state of turmoil at the moment. And part of my job as an analyst is to look at the different ways in which that turmoil takes form. And so in this presentation, I was asked to say something about the nature of the world in turmoil. The first point I would make is the very obvious one, that the 21st century is the Asian century. And the reason that that is the case is because if you look at this map with the circle drawn on it, the straight fact is that more than half of the world's population live inside that circle. The rest of us live outside of the circle. And for that reason alone, for good and for bad, for rich and for poor, this is the Asian century. But it's not entirely as simple as that, because if we look towards the end of the century, look at world population by region, the world population will break down by 2100 into, on present trends, and they won't vary very much, even if they change a little bit. It'll break down quite neatly into 11 billion people, from the 7 billion, 7.5 billion people we have at the moment to 11 billion. And it will break down into 5, 4, and 2. 5 billion people in Asia, 4 billion people in Africa, and 2 billion people everywhere else. And if you look at that trend line, you can see that the Asian population will peak in around about 2040, 2050 and begin to decline a little bit. And that's natural when we look at developments of growing middle class countries in China and Southeast Asia. And it's the African population which will increase, because the trends are that population decline has not taken place in Africa in the way that it has elsewhere. And so from being a rather small part of the world's population in the 1950s and 1960s, I lived all my student life with Africa. It was always the 10% continent, 10% of world population, 10% of roughly of world's GNP, 10% of everything. Africa is going to become a very important part of the century in the way that Asia is a very important part of the 21st century. And for that reason, Africa is therefore a strategically important place, a strategically important continent, much more so than ever before in human history. And for that reason, you can see already that Africa has become the center, growing center of instability, terrorism in North Africa and in the Maghreb countries and across the Saharan basin. In sub-Saharan West Africa, there is a great deal of instability. In East Africa, also a great deal of instability. And you yourselves know of the politics better than I do, the politics of Southern Africa. And so it isn't just that Africa itself is a troubled continent, but it is also a continent of great strategic importance to the rest of the world and growing strategic importance. And that is a factor which has got to be managed. The news isn't all bad by any means, but that's a factor that will have to be managed for the future. And so while we're looking at that, there are 2 or 3 big trends which are worth thinking about. One is the big four and the return to big power politics. It's often said that we've had a holiday from history since the end of the Cold War in 1991, that there's been a 30-year hiatus, and that now we're back into the old routine that we've known more familiarly for the last 200 or 300 years. And the big four powers and the 4 leaders that matter to us are, of course, the United States, America, China, India, and Russia. And they are the big 4 powers, all for different reasons. The United States is enormous because it just is, and has been now for 150 years. China is the coming power under Xi Jinping. He's been in power since 2012 and has made an enormous difference to China's position in the world. And Narendra Modi in India. India has overtaken China now in terms of global population, its total population on the globe. And Modi though he's a democratic leader, he fixes elections pretty efficiently. And he's a very one-party state dictatorial leader. And then Vladimir Putin, is a leader. He's been in power now since 1999. He set himself up to be in power until 2036, if necessary, and he's leading Russia into very clear, different waters. The point about these four leaders is that two of these four leaders, in China and Russia, are explicitly revisionist, which is to say that they are trying to change the way world politics works. Both China and Russia are trying to, as it were, push back on Western influence everywhere in the world, including in Africa, and are determined to change the rules of the international system, which the rest of us have lived by for the last 2.5 to 3 centuries. And so they are revisionist in the way that some of the powers in the 1930s in East Asia and Africa, and particularly in Europe, were revisionist in those days too. So 2 out of 4 powers are explicitly revisionist, and that's a real challenge to the Western world. Here in Europe, of course, we see that in Ukraine. Ukraine's a very big country. It's the biggest European country by land mass. Only Russia is bigger by land mass if you count Russia as a European country. And of course, it matters hugely to Russia in ways that I'll mention in a moment. But for Europe, we look at the continent in which we live is now very vulnerable to instability. There is the Russian challenge in Ukraine. There is a Russian client in Belarus. But you go down through the Western Balkans to Turkey, into Syria and the Middle East, into Russian behavior in Libya, and then the terrorist threats, the Islamic terrorist threats through ISIS and Al-Qaeda in North Africa. It's a very unstable region, or increasingly unstable region, in which we find ourselves. And the Europeans are having to learn the lesson that prosperity and security are not a given. They don't arise naturally. They have to be worked at, and they cost money. And I think that lesson is working its way through European politics at the moment. We've had a very easy time for the last 30-odd years, and that time is now coming to an end. And this is what worries the Russians. This is why Putin is the sort of person that he is. Those are the territories that Russia lost, as it were, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And so going, as it were, anti-clockwise from the top, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the 3 Baltic states were all part of the old Soviet Union, then Belarus, Ukraine, of course, Moldova, and then coming down into the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then the stands, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, and then Kazakhstan, the great Kazakhstan. All of those were part of the old Soviet Union. And that's what changed in 1991. In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was replaced by 15 new or other states. And Russia suddenly found itself with 14 other states on its borders that used to be part of Moscow's own internal empire. And that is something which the Russians have been trying to reverse. That's why Putin is such a revisionist, because he's trying to reverse that process, not necessarily by conquest, but certainly by mixture of small-scale conquest and large-scale influence. And so he's competing with the West for the influence in the rest of the world, partly because of this decline of great power Russia that he saw in the collapse of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in China, the area that is most delicate in China is what the Chinese refer to themselves as the first island chain and the second island chain. And the first island chain, as you can see, runs from Japan through to include Taiwan, of course, and the South China Sea. And that big curve around the South China Sea is called the 9-dash line. It goes back to, in this particular case, 1952, where the Chinese claimed all of those waters as their own, even though those waters are part of the exclusive zones of Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam. And those countries have competed with China on this. They've taken China to the International Court of Arbitration, and they've won on every count, but the Chinese just ignore it. And what China wants to do is to exert complete dominance in that area of the first island chain. They regard that as all Chinese territory. And the second island chain goes further eastwards towards the Indonesia. And the second island chain is an area in which they assume they should have power, countervailing power to anything the United States or Australia or the Western countries might do. And if we're looking at areas of potential conflict, then this push by China to assert itself in the Pacific, and also in those two little red patched areas on the border with India. There are constant disputes over the Chinese-Indian border, and that too is a source of incipient conflict. The other source of great conflict between China and India is what are known as the string of pearls. The Chinese have got, if you look at the little red dots there in the broken line, the string of pearls are all of the sea bases that China has, the ports and the bases that it can use from China and Hong Kong itself, in Cambodia, in Myanmar, in Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka. They own the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka, to Gwadar, the port that they're building in Pakistan, right through to the Gulf. And there in the Gulf, it's not marked on this map, but the Chinese have opened their first foreign military base in Djibouti, right next to the American base, as it happens, right at the entrance to the Gulf of Aden. And this, we can argue about whether this is important or not, but this really worries India. And the Indians see this as a sort of containment of Indian power, not just in the Himalayas, but also in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And that sets the terms of a incipient competition between India and China. And so the big four powers create the weather for the political weather for the rest of us in the world. And then, of course, there's the United States. And the US ought to be seen as a single continent of North America, because economically it is, with the resources of Canada, the engine of growth of the United States, and the labor and also the markets of Mexico. That is a unit, an economic unit of $24-25 trillion a year in terms of GDP. So it's a very powerful economic unit. And of course, that map also illustrates for us that the United States is a three-front power. It has one front in the Atlantic, one front in the Pacific, and one front in the Arctic, which is really important to it and of growing importance. But in the immediate sense, the United States is far more concerned with the Pacific because of the Asian century than it is with the Atlantic. And it is somewhat ironic, of course, that the present United States is so committed to the aiding the government in Kyiv over the war in Ukraine, because this is not the general direction in which the United States is going. For the time being, it's good for the West Europeans that it is, but this is not the norm. The norm is that the United States is turning inexorably to its interests in the Pacific Ocean more than its interests in the Atlantic Ocean. And so the big four are the structurers. They create the weather for the rest of us. And then there are a number of transnational drivers of structural change. And these are the things that are difficult to manage internationally. And these are the things that cause us a great deal of turmoil. One, of course, is climate change. Climate change takes many forms. It's about atmosphere. It's about emissions. It's about greenhouse gases. That slide there just tries to capture some of the different elements of climate change. And climate change is the one factor in world politics that will not go away if you ignore it. Most things in world politics, even if they're imperialism, even if they're the rise of fascism, eventually they wear off. After 50 years, 60 years, a century, 2 centuries, they go away. They're replaced by something else. If the science is right on climate change, it won't go away unless or until we deal with it. It won't wear off. It will keep on going. And I think there's no great dispute about climate change now, at least scientifically. And that headline at The Guardian there, global climate crisis, inevitable, unprecedented, and irreversible, I would argue probably summarizes where we are as far as the science of it goes. That it is inevitable, it's unprecedented, and it is irreversible unless we do something about it. It will not go away. And I don't think there's any argument about that from a scientific point of view. What we do about it, of course, is another issue. And if we look at carbon, the CO2 emissions, we're back to the big four again. This is a chart of CO2 emissions in the world. And look at the top 5: China, the United States, the European Union as a whole, India, and Russia. So if those 5 countries, if you take the EU as a single unit, but those 5 emitters account for most of it. And so you would think that in the nature of dealing with international problems that have to be dealt with, that have to be addressed, you would imagine that that's simpler than some. because there are not that many people to get round the table to make it happen. But of course, you can't get round the table to make it happen in that way, because China, the United States, India, and Russia all take different views, and they trade off their commitment to climate change against other things that they are also trying to promote and create. And so the politics of the big four, and in this case, the European Union or the Europeans, also feature in this in a pretty big way. So climate change is one of the great transnational forces. Then there are novel technologies. We all know about robotics and artificial intelligence, material science, computing. We're all on top of some of those elements. But what about the more exotic versions of some of those things? What about nanotechnology, shape-shifting, the ability of form to actually get bigger and smaller according to its own intelligence, things that can actually change their shape according to what they think they need to do to perform their task? What about biotechnology, gene editing? You know all about that in the Fetessa organization, I'm sure. And we're on the verge of a real revolution in gene editing, an ethical revolution, as well as a scientific revolution. What about augmented reality, the ability to create synthetic environments, to replicate completely the environment of a city and work out what happens when you turn off all the traffic lights or interfere with the electric supply to one area, or interfere with the water supply? What are the knock-on effects? We know a great deal now through augmented reality. Quantum computing, the ability to use subatomic particles as processors that are so fast, 100 million times faster than the fastest current computers, that would smash all forms of encryption. I mean, every encryption that we presently work on would be useless in the face of quantum computing. Now, quantum computing already exists. It's a long way from being a computer that sits on our desks, but governments have access to it. And as it develops in the next 10 years, it will give some governments the ability to smash all encryption. And then artificial intelligence. We talk a lot about this at the moment, new levels of autonomy, so that artificial intelligence doesn't just do what we tell it, it works out what it thinks it needs to do and moves forward in ways that we ourselves as human beings can't fully understand. That's pretty novel as intelligence goes. And the question about all of this is, we don't know what these new technologies will look like. We just don't know. We're interested in them. From my point of view, the questions are, which bits of them can be weaponized and who will weaponize them? Always some parts of technology are capable of weaponization. We just don't know which bits, and we don't know who will weaponize them. But we know who won't. They won't be weaponized by and large by the Europeans. They won't be weaponized by countries like South Africa or countries like Nigeria or Ethiopia or Kenya. But they might well be weaponized by the United States, perhaps almost certainly by China, maybe by Russia, maybe elements by India. It's the weaponization of novel technologies that is a source of potential instability. And believe me, all of the big four are pushing very hard to understand the weaponization of some of these very novel technologies. And then there's the question of cyber and space. Our internet works effectively on cables, undersea cables, great networks of undersea cables, which move around the world. And there's a view of the main cable lines. 95% of all of the internet is by cable at the moment. But that is going to change, because cables are relatively cheap, but they're fairly vulnerable and they do need to be laid. And after the cables, of course, you've got to have billions of miles of copper wiring to take the cable traffic internally to the countries or the terminals that want access to the internet. And those cables are being replaced by space, by the use of low Earth orbits. There are three big orbits that are useful. There's the outer orbit and the geostationary orbit, where above the equator, something will orbit at 24,500 miles away from the Earth, or 40,000 kilometers, and it will turn exactly as the world turns. And so above the equator, it will appear to stand still. But north and south of the equator, like in South Africa and in Britain, of course, that isn't the case. And so satellites will come in constellations of 3 or 5, as it were, coming over the horizon, being with us for half an hour, 40 minutes, they disappear, and then the next one comes over the horizon. And so the orbit that really matters to us for communications is the inner orbit there, the low Earth orbit. Very, very useful. But the low Earth orbit is very, very crowded. There are at least 8,000 working spacecraft in low Earth orbit of one sort or another. There are almost 1 million pieces of debris in orbit, ranging from tiny flecks of something right through to spanners and gloves and tools that have been left, and bits of satellites that are broken up for one reason or another. And there are due to be many more. Elon Musk has over 3,000 satellites that he's put up in Starlink, which are at the moment leading the field in terms of low Earth orbit. And the Starlink's plan is to launch 40,000 satellites, and there are other providers. And so low Earth orbit is not now the preserve of governments. It is now becoming the commercialized, useful orbit. And the reason that low Earth orbit is used in this way is because it will replace cables as the source of internet connectivity. And so the point about satellites is that once they're there, they're very cheap, and anywhere in a continent, in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, in the middle of the DRC, or wherever it might be, you can get a link without relying on cables and copper wiring to give you a connection. And so from using satellites for less than 5% of internet traffic, quite soon we'll be using cables, and we'll be using satellites for close to 100% of internet traffic. That's the direction in which it's going. And that's a big, big change in the politics of communication, and so much else that will be dependent on that, right through to our cash machines and our ability to lead our ordinary lives and to organize our public services. It's a big, big change. And then thirdly, finally, as a big trend, are the fact that society's changed from the inside. We're going through a big process of change in the 21st century because all societies are collections of their own institutions. Institutions are fundamental to the way societies work, and we're all changing for different reasons. All societies are changing around the world, and that's inevitable. But some of that change is stressing a lot of our internal institutions. One point is that one-party government anywhere in the world is usually a bad thing. When parties stay in power for too long, it doesn't matter who they are, what they are, it doesn't matter what country you're talking about, that government normally becomes sclerotic, it normally becomes corrupt, it usually becomes very, very inefficient. One-party government anywhere in the world, whatever the party is, whatever the ideology is, whatever the country is, turns out almost always to be, or in fact always to be, a very bad thing. And that's something that I'm sure you think about, and we think about in the Western world as well, because we've got politics in the West which are formally democratic, which don't conform to most democratic ideals of change and turnover of ideas and ideological approaches. And even in the United States, there is something fundamentally destabilizing happening. The QAnon movement, the conspiracy movement that began only about 10 years ago, is quite astonishing. QAnon has these crazy ideas. It was based on the notion that the world was actually run by a group of pedophiles based around Hillary Clinton, who were meeting in a restaurant, a pizza restaurant in downtown DC. And these people were running conspiracies all over the world to kidnap children, kill them, take their blood, and use it to try and inject into themselves for eternal life. And QAnon then hatched lots of other conspiracies, which basically said nothing that any government says to you is true. That the country or the world and your country is being run by a group of conspirators who are only out for themselves and are doing dreadful things to children. Now, the point is not that some crazy people believe all of this. The point is that some people who are not crazy, lots of people who are not crazy, believe some of it. And that's the danger of conspiracy theories. If they are loud enough and repeated often enough, then they end up in this on the right-hand side, the attack on the Capitol in 2020, 2021 rather, in January 2021, 6th of January, in which this group of people spontaneously, stupidly tried to prevent the handover of democratic power from President Trump to President Biden. And although it was ridiculous, it was also dangerous. Remember, 5 people died that day. If those conspirators, those rioters had got hold of Mike Pence or Nancy Pelosi that day, they would have killed them, undoubtedly. They would have murdered them if they got hold of them. that was pretty serious. And this is happening in the United States. And of course, we see now that the United States is in a state of real political turmoil as the sheer hatred between Democrats and Republicans, as it always threatens to go onto the streets. Now, what this represents, even in the United States, is a breakdown in the authority of institutions. And that's one of the things that we are all concerned about. Societies change from within, not really from without. Sometimes there's pressure outside of society, but if those societies give into those pressures, it's normally because they've changed from the inside in order to make them vulnerable. And that's the problem that we're looking at. A very good way of thinking about this is the book by Niall Ferguson, some years ago now, it's about 10 years old, I guess, called The Square and the Tower. And what Niall Ferguson looks at in this book is he says, this is Siena, the beautiful Italian city of Siena. And there's the marketplace, the square, and there's the tower, which was the government. And he said that this goes back through history. In the square, the marketplace, human interaction takes place. People come to, they trade, they talk, they sell anything they can, they engage in prostitution, they do whatever human beings do. It's just the morass of human nature in the square. But the tower represents the government. And the tower overlooks the square, and the tower, as it were, restrains what the square is able to do. The tower is the institutions. And the tower says, well, yes, you can trade in this and that, but you can't trade in something else, and you certainly can't engage in prostitution. And so we will regulate what you can do in the square. As long as you behave in the way that we approve, then you can go on doing it. And there's this constant competition, says Niall Ferguson, between the square and the tower, between the marketplace and the institutions themselves of government. And what we're seeing now is not unprecedented in history, but we're seeing a period in this era of the internet, this era of social media, where the square seems to be almost unregulated, quite hard to regulate, and the tower seems to have not much influence on what is happening in the square. But that, of course, is only part of the picture, because some governments are re-establishing the authority of the tower very, very strongly. In China, in Russia, in the authoritarian governments, in Turkey, for instance, Erdogan in Turkey, in some of the dictatorships that we see in the Middle East, in the royal autocracies of the Gulf, many governments are asserting the power of the tower of what happens in the square. But in the Western world, the square is much more predominant at the moment than the tower. So it's a way of thinking about it. The square and the tower, it's this constant competition between the marketplace and government as regulator. And we can see in this sort of idea, the way in which the autocracies, the towers are asserting themselves. And this is the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index. They haven't updated the 2017 one yet, particularly, but it's pretty good, this 2017 one. So the bluer the country, the more democratic it's regarded as. The redder the country, the less democratic it's regarded as. And we can see there pretty clear sense of the power of the autocracies. And you'll note, interestingly, that both South Africa and Britain are regarded as flawed democracies, not the best, flawed democracies compared, say, to Canada or Australia or Scandinavia. And I guess that's a pretty fair assumption, certainly from where I sit. Looking at us and looking at you, I'd say we only really deserve a light blue rather than a dark blue designation on this. But it's clear that the world is split increasingly between essentially open societies and essentially authoritarian regimes, or regimes which are becoming more authoritarian. And this is the way in which it tends to play out in ways that matter to us. The internet. There are at the moment 3 different internets. There's as it were, the original American-led internet, although it was invented in Britain by Tim Berners-Lee in the 1980s, who's still with us, of course, him and his brother. But it was taken over, commercialized in the United States. And so the internet, the original internet, if you like, is the American internet, and it's very much a free market internet. And then there's a second internet, is the European internet, which is the European countries, in relation to the square and the tower, are trying to regulate it more, saying, well, you can't do this on the internet. You've got privacy issues. There are data protection issues, and governments in Europe are regulating the internet much more so than the United States government. And there's a competition going on really between the American internet and the European internet. But the third internet is the authoritarian internet, the one that's marked there really in grey, in dark grey. And the authoritarian internet doesn't worry at all about privacy issues. It doesn't worry about all the things that we argue in Europe with our American friends about. They just use the internet for governmental purposes. And the point about these three internets is that between the American, the European, and the authoritarian internet will probably win the competition. Because at the moment, about 60% of the world is, or 60% of the population of the world is on the internet. The other 40% will come onto the internet. But if you look at where those other 40% live, they live in countries which are predominantly or likely to become authoritarian on present trends. And so the authoritarian internet is set to become more prevalent in the world than the free internets of America or Britain, while we argue about levels of regulation. And that, I think, is one example of the trend that we're talking about, that societies change from within. What determines how societies change is how they relate to their institutions, and the way in which we inform ourselves about our institutions, the way in which we develop our views of what is politically important and what isn't, and how we talk about politics is fundamentally affected now by how the internet works. And by the internet, I mean not just emails, I mean social interaction, social media, everything that depends on the internet in order to function as a form of human interaction in the marketplace between the square and the tower, the marketplace of human ideas. And so when we look at the world, are we looking at the first image on the top left or the second image on the bottom right? The first image on the top left suggests that the world is a time bomb, and that time bomb only has to be lit and it will blow up. The second image on the bottom right, I think, is where I am on this, and what I think is more likely, which is that we are being hit by a series of quite large thumps. I don't think the world's going to blow up, but it is going to be pushed around. It is going to be cracked a little bit. It is going to be fractured in the coming 20 or 30 years. We can live through that. That's important. That image on the bottom right slightly overstates the nature of the fracture, I would say. But there is a big thump that is beginning to happen in world politics. It's not going to explode, but it is going to be difficult to manage, and it will require all of our ingenuity in the next 30 or 40 years to manage it. And for that reason, we shouldn't be in despair, but we should, I think, gear ourselves up to the challenges to come. Thank you for your attention.